We're talking athlete post-workout recovery. We are blowing minds and changing lives, and we are starting right now. I'm David Barr. If you're looking to get bigger, faster, stronger, get leaner, go longer, hit that subscribe and then the little bell so you don't miss the latest updates. And in this part of the series, I am talking about recovery for athletes. I've never given this talk in public before. This is strictly for NSCA interns in the past. So this is going to be raw. I'm going to try to cut this as little as possible, and you're going to get the information that only a select few have received so far. And this is going to be the basis for my 5th book, and that's going to be published 2018, but there's a lot of stuff we have to cover. So I'm going to break this into a multiple part series, and let's just jump right into it. So you can think of this one as more of a reset on recovery, because right now it's like we're head down the tracks on a train. We are trying to get to a destination that is ultimately just optimal recovery. And in terms of information, we are trying to make that train go faster and faster and faster. And unfortunately, we are not going towards the destination we want. We are actually getting further away from our destination. So as we pile on more and more info, we're actually getting further away from where we want. So the idea is to kind of slow that train down, hit the reset button, say, okay, what the hell are we talking about here? Let's actually figure out what it is we're discussing, trying to apply different recovery techniques, and then proceed with actual interventions, etc. So starting off, 5 things we all know about recovery. Everybody knows about recovery. And the warning is, as soon as you hear everybody knows, that's a huge red flag, right? Okay, there's no everybody knows. So 5 things we all know about recovery. 1, exercise is a stress, and stress is bad. We hate stress. We have to get rid of stress as soon as possible, right? Comes with inflammation. Inflammation is just something that's terrible. We have to get rid of inflammation as soon as possible. And it comes along with the stress of training, of exercise, that kind of thing. Really, really bad. Everybody knows this, right? So if we get rid of this stress, we'll recover better. We'll have more recovery. And we all know what that means, right? Everybody knows what that means. So this is just perfect. It's coming together perfectly right now, right? As far as the application, we could just do a one-size-fits-all. I mean, it really doesn't matter what the person's doing, what their goals are, their sport, what phase they're in. I mean, it really doesn't matter. It really just matters that we apply our favorite recovery interventions, and everyone knows this. Everyone does this already. So we're in good shape right now. And number 5 is that techniques like massage will help increase blood flow to muscle. They will remove those toxins and poisons like lactic acid and bring in nutrients to help facilitate recovery, which again, everybody already knows what recovery is, so we don't even have to worry about defining that, right? Now, what happens if we back up and go, okay, wait a minute, what is recovery? Because in reality, it's actually more of a male enhancement effect. If you're familiar with male enhancement pills, everybody knows what male enhancement is until you're asked to define exactly what male enhancement is, right? And then you realize, well, wait a minute, it's actually a half dozen different things that everybody thinks it is. But because no one actually asks each other about their definitions for it, we all just assume we are talking about the same thing. And even though they're similar, each individual tends to have a different perception of what that is. And it's the same thing for recovery. Until we actually define it, we are not necessarily talking about the same thing, right? So everybody knows exactly what recovery is until we're asked to define exactly what recovery is. And then it kind of falls apart. So in order to understand this, we first have to look at something called the gas curve, general adaptation syndrome, or the Selye curve, sometimes it's called, after Professor Hans Selye, a Czech-Canadian researcher who came up with this idea. And it's basically that our recovery or ultimate adaptive response from a stress, and don't forget, exercise is a stress, training is a stress. It is a stress that we intentionally induce on our body, so we will ultimately recover and then adapt, right? So the idea is that we go through 4 phases in this recovery adaptation sequence. So immediately after the exercise bout, we start to lose strength, power, speed, etc. This happens regardless of nutrient timing, okay? You could have 0 glycogen depletion 4 hours after a bout, and you are still going to be slower and weaker, right? That's just part of the recovery process. This is not bad, Okay, this is just something we all go through. This is known as the fatigue component of the gas curve. Next comes the recovery part. Okay, so we are no longer getting slower, weaker, getting further away from that baseline fitness from where we started. We're actually starting to come up now. We're starting to get back to normal. And once we hit 0 point, so there's no more deficit in strength or speed, for example, we are at baseline fitness, we are said to be recovered. Okay, we have achieved recovery. Now, do we want to train again? Maybe, not necessarily, right? And in fact, probably not, because we're just at baseline. We haven't adapted yet. And this is a fundamental problem with recovery. If we are just focused on getting back to baseline, we are potentially shooting ourselves in the foot in terms of the different interventions that we're using, right? It could actually be potentially harmful to our adaptive response, which is why most people train most of the time. Now, there is an exception to this. Typically, in-season team sport athletes aren't looking to adapt. They are just treading water, right? They're trying to maintain baseline fitness. So they're just trying to get back to zero fitness, baseline fitness after that stress, after that physiological insult. Okay, so they really do want recovery. They're not worried about adaptation most of the time. Okay, but for most people, most of the time, they're looking for that adaptive response. And we are just at recovery, right? We still have, more phases to go in the gas curve. So moving on, we start to push upwards. It's called super compensation. Okay, that adaptive response that we're after, bigger, faster, stronger, getting leaner, going longer, that kind of thing, right? That is what most people are after. And if we just focus on recovery, we are largely shooting ourselves in the foot. So focusing on adaptation is going to be key. It's going to be paramount for most people. And it's really something we have to start adjusting our paradigm, our way of thinking about recovery, and understanding that when people talk about recovery, they typically don't define what they're talking about. And this has been a problem, because if you can't define what you're talking about and then you don't do so, then how can you actually apply different interventions? It can often screw us up, and it has, and we have examples of that. So we'll talk about those in a bit. So the super compensation phase, we are going up, we are getting bigger, faster, stronger. Once we hit that peak, ideally, we would then train again. So we are training with greater intensity. We can train with heavier loads, for example, because we are now stronger. Now, more advanced athletes don't need to be fully adaptive. You can actually train before you're even fully recovered. Smolov squat program is a perfect example. You just keep hammering yourself for a week, and then you back off and you let the body have a massive super compensation phase. This is typically more for advanced athletes who have a lot of control over their lifestyle. They have very well-regulated training. It's been mapped out for years typically. Very advanced coaches can do this typically if you're dealing with one-on-one clients, like track and field athletics athletes may be successful with this, but it's really more of an advanced thing, training with incomplete recovery, and we'll discuss that in different parts of this athlete recovery series. But for now, for most people, they're going to want to train as close to that peak super compensation phase as possible, right? So you're stronger, so you can train with heavier weights and increase the loads, increase the stress on the body. Now, going back to stress, why do we want stress? Well, there's not just one type of stress. Typically, this is a generalization we make, and when we say stress, we're typically talking about psychosocial stresses. I'm getting stressed out from bills and taxes and friends and family, right? That's a bad thing. It's unavoidable, not a big deal, but it's bad. We call that distress. And we distinguish that from a positive stress that we get from training, which is called eustress. Okay, this is the positive stress that we induce, and we intentionally do so. The entire point of training is to stress the body, right? So it then goes through the fatigue, recovery, super compensation phases. We have the adaptation, and then ultimately bigger, faster, stronger, right? So you see how this progresses, and we keep building on that with subsequent cycles. With more and more training bouts, we are getting bigger, faster, stronger, so we can then induce a greater stress on the body, and so on. That's how we keep building long term. This is how we adapt long term. But if we're just focused on recovery, you see how this is a problem, right? That's going to shoot us in the foot, and it has for a long time. There's plenty of examples of that we will go into. But for now, for athlete recovery post-workout, it's very important to understand just fundamentally that long-term recovery, what we are talking about is really long-term adaptation. That is key. If we can make that one change, that one paradigm shift across all athletes and coaches, we would have a profoundly far, far more advanced view of recovery, adaptation, and their applications. But right now we're kind of stuck because we really don't know exactly what we're talking about, so we're kind of fumbling along in the dark when it comes to interventions. So again, we will go into that more in future videos, but right now we just need to have that fundamental change, that fundamental understanding of athlete post-workout recovery and adaptation, and this is the long-term recovery. So what are the different types of recovery? We'll go into that in another part in the series, and I will link to that. Make sure you check that out because there's a lot more. We have a lot to cover. Again, this is a whole book worth of information. There's a ton of stuff here, so let's wrap that up. So be sure to check out different videos in this athlete post-workout recovery series. Thanks for watching. I'm David Barr. Until next time, raise the bar.